Hey, Rocky Peak. I hope you guys are doing well. My name is Joey. I'm on staff here at the church, and I'm joined right now by Joel Enyart. Joel, how are you doing?
Doing well. Hello, Rocky Peak. Doing well, Joey. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we just wrapped up a really big series for our church, one of the most, I think, ambitious series that we've ever done. Yeah. It was called Worldview, Renewing Your Mind, and it was all about exploring different worldviews, different beliefs out there that people hold that maybe they don't even realize that they hold.
Yes.
And this was a big series for our church. I think it was really stretching for a lot of people. It was out of some people's comfort zone. And so we wanted to give people an opportunity to ask some questions of one of the pastors that you spoke twice in the series.
I
right?
did, yes.
Yeah. So just, follow-up questions about the series. So what was your kind of initial just like thought now that we're like past it, thoughts on Worldview?
Well, I mean, I was geeking out in the series.
Yeah.
Just because I know, like, in my own journey of faith, being raised in a Christian family, there's so much good and so much that you just inherit with that, like, my adolescent journey was really my own wrestling with is this real, what I received? And so it was in college where I discovered the whole field of apologetics, and that just lit a fire in my mind. And so any chance we get to talk about the deep things of our faith from that intellectual side, I love, but I never want it to just simply be an intellectual endeavor. I love it when it's something that, like, we can think deep, but it also touches all sorts of facets of life. And so to me, when Jesus talks about truth, I think truth is so much more than just something we intellectually give assent to. It's a truth that's experiential and transformational. And so the hope is that we leaned, that's the proper past tense of that word, heavily into the intellectual aspects, but the hope is that it awakens that hunger to want to know him more. So I think anytime you chase good theology should always lead you to a deeper love of God. And if your theology is not leading you to a deeper love of God, you should step back, wrestle with your theology, but then also wrestle with your heart. Yeah. So
one thing you talked about when you were speaking was this idea of reconstructing your faith. Like, there's going to be things that you have to deconstruct. If you're born into a Christian faith, like I was, you're handed a set of beliefs and ideologies.
Yes.
And when you're young, you're like, that's great. Sounds awesome.
Yeah.
Thumbs up.
Let's sing the songs and go to Sunday school and get the stickers.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. But you haven't reasoned through them yet.
Yes.
And so getting to do that as a longtime Christian was a really cool process for me. And I'm sure a lot of people through this series were honing what they believed about God and the Bible and everything.
Absolutely. And I love to give that permission. Like if we're not allowed to wrestle with our faith and ask the scary, awkward questions, I think what we do is we put people in an intellectual closet of fear. Instead of like, no, let's bring that out on the table and look at it, because I really doubt there's any question you and I are going to ask that the church hasn't wrestled with in one way or another in the last 2,000 years. And to suddenly realize I'm not alone in asking this question. Others have wrestled with this. And here's how some monk in the 4th century was wrestling with his own faith. And then you just realize how connected the human journey of faith really is. And so I think to give that permission. And so, like, with my own daughters, like when they were little, I would say, here's what we believe. And I would try to help, like, teach and train on those things. But I'd say there's going to come a point in your journey where you're going to have to decide, what do you believe? But just giving that permission to process. And there was never a moment where there was a question that was off limits. And it's like, if I don't know, well, shoot, you just gave me something to go figure out. And to honestly share that, like, I have to think about that. And so just building that spirit of exploration and just that freedom to pursue. Because if it's true, it's going to hold up. If it's not true, then we should figure that out and move on.
Yeah, totally. Correct me if I'm wrong. You were the one that kind of stumbled across the Faithfully Different book by Natasha Crane, right?
Yes. So that was a book that we found in our journey of coming back to Rocky Peak. So we were in a challenging context for us, that just a lot of issues were emerging in the context that we were in that created some challenges for us as a family, and then specifically for my daughters. Like, there was one particular Sunday, I'm up in the offices of our old church, and my youngest daughter is in Christy's office just crying because she doesn't want to go. And I'm like, there's something wrong with that. Like, why is that? And she was being bullied by this peer base because they were not liking us as parents. And some of what I would just describe are positional beliefs that we weren't even holding in a very strong way. And so, like that. There were just many reasons we knew it was time to leave. But as we were leaving, I wanted to make sure that their faith was intact. I knew that they still loved Jesus, and I didn't want them to give up on the church. And so I was just looking for a resource that I could give them that would help them wrestle with those questions that they'd been challenged on a lot, and say like, hey, no, there are good answers, and there are gracious postures for answers that aren't always popular.
Yeah.
And then it was such a bonus that it was written by a woman, because it's like here's like a strong thinking woman for my daughters to look up to.
Totally.
And that was very important, because so much of what I've resonated with C.S. Lewis and some of these great thinkers, and it's they're men, and there's nothing wrong with that, but it's like, hey, women are brilliant thinkers too. And so to find her was like this double win on that front.
Yeah.
For me as a parent to give that resource to them.
Totally.
So,
and were there any initial like takeaways or paradigm shifts for you as you were reading the book that was like surprising to you the first time?
I think what's really interesting when you think of reasons for why the Christian faith is sound, or a Christian worldview is sound, those aren't new reasons. They've been they've been around for 2,000 years. They find a new expression with every generation or every cultural context. So what I was really appreciative of Natasha's book was how she was framing the Christian worldview within current cultural realities. And so here's why we're seeing the cultural challenges that are going on, and yet here's why you can still hold on to your belief. And then I thought she did a really good job of attempting to have a gracious posture, which is hard to do because we're such a divided culture. And anytime you differentiate, it creates challenge and struggle. But you can still choose to embrace what Jesus teaches you to do, which would be, then turn that other cheek, love your enemy, pray for those, bless those who persecute you.
Yeah.
But the challenge in our culture is that disagreement is always, oftentimes viewed as judgmental. And it's like, no, I just disagree.
Yeah.
Are we not allowed to just disagree?
Right.
But we're not.
Yeah.
And so as a Christian, I still have to figure out, how do I disagree amicably?
Yeah.
So
totally. Well, that leads into the first question we put out. We offered to any of our Instagram followers who wanted to respond with questions that kind of came up during the Worldview series.
All right.
And I think this is a really good one. How do we keep from having an us versus them mentality when sharing our worldview?
Yes. Oh, such a good question. How do we guard against an us versus them mentality? And I would think we have to hone in on the most important word in that statement, which is the verses. So I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But first, I think we need to recognize there is an us and there is a them. That's just reality. When two people believe different things, and then what we want to make of that determines then how divisive and ugly we get. But if two people are sitting at a table with radically different views, there is a differentiation between them. So now the question is, how do we engage when we disagree?
Yeah.
And so I think for us to recognize, it's okay to recognize there is an us who believes X, and there is a them that believes not X or Y or Z or whatever. But what we're never called to do in that differentiation is to create the verses, the antagonistic stance. So it's like Paul will say, our struggle is not against flesh and blood, it's against rulers and powers. So my verses as a follower of Jesus, I'm saying it right. My verses,
Sure.
my not my Bible verses. My what I am contending against.
Yes.
Is the ideas embodied in the person.
Yeah.
But not the person themselves.
Yeah. Totally.
And so that's where it's like, I think we need to recognize, so there is an us versus them, or an us and them, but the verses is against the ideas. And then to engage with this person by do I truly know who they are? Do I understand their story? Assuming we have a friendship.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, you might have the one-off coffee shop encounter, and then those are maybe unique moments. But if I'm talking about colleagues, family members, people that I go to school with, have I really taken the time to understand what their story is? Because the more I can understand who they are, then, like Michael talked about as we wrapped up the series, looking for those opportunities to build bridges to who they are as a human being. But then also, as I understand their beliefs and their values, can I show how Jesus might actually affirm something they're looking for? And so somebody that's like has a strong bent towards justice, it's like, hey, Jesus, like he's cheering that on too.
Yeah.
Have you ever looked at how he's approached it?
Yeah.
Because he might have thoughts on that. Like, so you just look for those touch points. I remember a good friend of ours years ago who never wanted to come to church because the church was full of hypocrites. And it was like, instead of being defensive about that, or you think I'm a hypocrite, being like, yeah, he's not wrong. Like, you're right. But that's where hypocrites need to go.
Yeah.
Because we need the hope of something that's going to lead us out of our hypocrisy.
Yeah.
And then when, like, long story, but when he finally came to Rocky Peak the first time, Michael was teaching, and Michael's whole sermon was like, why God doesn't like hypocrites. And it was just this, like, God, the brilliance of God.
Yeah,
Because
totally.
he was like, God thinks like me. And then that narrative shifted. And then how do I think more like him? Right.
Yeah.
So it's just neat. And then he's a part of our church now today.
Yeah. That's so cool.
But we had to choose to not be offended by the indictment.
Yeah, totally.
So.
Well, I know for me, the offense, the anger can make it really hard to engage in someone in a loving way.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's where it's like we have to constantly check ourselves when we're engaging with a world that's going to be aggressive towards us, but we are not called to play the game the same way. And so if we're ever finding ourselves in an aggressive posture, it doesn't mean we don't hold our ground, but we're not meant to have an aggressive posture towards people. And so if there's going to be rejection in a relationship, let it be from the other side.
Yeah. Oh, interesting.
You know, so it's like, like I'm still here. Like I didn't get up from the table.
Yeah.
That sort of a thing.
Yeah.
And then we do our best.
Yeah, totally.
So,
that's all we can do.
Yeah. So I think it is important to recognize there is an us and them, because if we're just going to dilute everything into this, oh, we're all just singing this one happy song of humanity together.
Right.
I think that's a lie that deceives people into everything's okay.
Yeah.
But if everything was okay, then why do we see the brokenness around us?
Yeah.
Why is there a cross? The cross should always remind us everything is not okay, but there's a God who will lead us into a life.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm okay now because of you.
Yeah. It's an admission to the problem.
Yes.
That we see in the world.
Yeah. And Christians should be the first ones to say, I have a problem.
Yeah.
Like it's like, so if we're gonna like point fingers, I'm gonna point a finger at myself and then drag you into it with me.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like versus pointing at you and be like, you. Be
totally.
Like,
yeah.
Me and you.
My wife and I were driving on the 118 once, and we saw someone had put a sign on an overpass, and it said, "You need Jesus." And I was like, why is that rubbing me the wrong way? Like, I love Jesus. You know, I theoretically believe that, you know, but why is that rubbing me the wrong way? And she's like, well, you just need to change the first word to we.
Yeah.
We need Jesus.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because like, I don't disagree with that statement.
Yeah.
I would just be like, hey, as a tactic, is that effective?
Yeah.
And I mean, you always have the stories of like the weird angry sign guy who had his one convert, and you're like, great, but you might have had more if you'd done it in another way.
Totally.
And I'm not saying that was an angry sign, but there is something about like shoving Jesus in someone's face. I don't think is how Jesus calls us to do it.
Yeah.
Because like ours is not an impositional faith. Ours is an invitational faith. And so it's that hey, come and see, that you see like the first followers of Jesus. I love it in John chapter 1. They're like, hey, come and see this man. And like, Jesus, can anything good come out of Nazareth? And I love the response. It wasn't defensive. It wasn't, let's go and like a high apologetic about the prophecies in Nazareth. It was just come and see.
Yeah.
And sometimes just that invitation at the right moment where someone's open is all we have to do, because the heavy lifting isn't really on us. Like our job is faithfulness. Yeah. But the heavy lifting, that's God's department.
Yeah. And there's an ease and a peace to that that I'm really drawn to.
Yeah.
Which is cool.
Yeah. Love it.
Are there any this is something someone asked, is there any stories that you have of sharing your worldview gone wrong or gone well?
Yeah, I'm sure both. I think one of the things that we have to step back and maybe like a higher view with this question is maybe reframing what our definition of success is. And so to me, I think I've had to step back and go, success isn't I closed the deal. I think so often that's what we think, like to be an effective evangelist. And I do believe certain people are gifted. I've had friends that are gifted evangelists, and I'll watch them in a conversation. And I'm like, how did you do that? How did you get there in a winsome way where that person is leaning into Jesus? And it's like, I have different giftings, and I've had to learn, though, even though I don't have the gift of evangelism, I still am called to obey the Great Commission. Yeah. Right? Like to go and make. And so, but there's that idea, like success might simply be a positive interaction with a follower of Jesus. Yeah. And so your kindness might be the apologetic that works far more than a well-reasoned argument. Not that we don't have those, but there's maybe that's not the right moment. Yeah. And so it goes when it goes poorly. Part of the reason it might go poorly is I have a wrong view of success, or I tried to push it too hard, too fast, and actually pushed the person away. And that has happened a lot in my, like, the pressure I'll put on myself.
Yeah. Totally.
Versus like, no, just be there. So some of the favorite stories is where it's almost like you just stumbled into a moment. And I didn't have my 1980s evangelistic 4 spiritual laws, Romans Road, plan ready to go. I'm not going out on the street corners doing that. And again, there may be a time and a place for that. It's just not me.
Totally.
But it's almost like you step into something and it's like suddenly this conversation is going somewhere. And I think that's where it's like we're told like to be prepared, to be ready in season, out of season. So just always to recognize like any moment might be something that God has brought you into collision with another person for the purpose of responding to something that's going on.
Yeah.
And to me, those are the most fun when you walk away and you're like, God, you take that then.
Yeah.
So it's like faithfulness and obedience is our department. The results, that's his department. And there's freedom when you can realize that.
Totally.
It's like Jesus' parable of the sower and the seeds. It's like, just go and sow those seeds. And I remember like reading that in college, and then he sent out the 72 in one of the gospel accounts. And so that's what he told them ahead of time. And I thought, what permission then for them to go and sow seeds and realize that how those seeds land and what happens with those seeds is now between God and that person.
Totally.
And then you also look, and according to that story, it was a 25% success rate.
Do we get that in Scripture?
Well, one of 4 seeds is the fruitful seed.
Oh, sure.
Right.
Oh,
so
I never thought about it that way. That's interesting.
So it's just like, also I think calibrating success, like if you're successful 25% of the time, then you're on par with that parable, right?
Yeah, that's cool.
And just to realize that, like, and maybe what looks like 75% failure is simply you're just laying the seed, and to recognize that we're on a large global team. And so Jesus' church is everywhere.
Yeah.
It's not just Rocky Peak. Yeah. It's just not me in that conversation. And so maybe my job is to just help push the conversation down the road for that person, trusting that like God's got their name already.
Totally.
And I'm going to be faithful to my part.
Yeah.
And there may be stories that we'll never see, but you are faithful to that moment with the barista at Starbucks.
Totally.
You were faithful to that moment. Like God put it on your heart to reach out and just hand money or whatever that was. Yeah. Your faithfulness is in alignment with a bigger story that we may never see till we get there. And we're like, I got to be a part of how many stories?
Yeah.
And
that's a cool way to look at it.
Yeah. And so I think like defining success in that sense is like, don't get hung up on the outcome. Seek to be faithful to the moment.
Yeah. I love that. A philosophy that our global missions pastor, Brian Moorhead, has.
Yes, I love Brian. You already have. I'm already in. Whatever you're gonna say.
There's no one tool. There's no one way. There's no one system. And so when he's preparing people to go on mission, his strategy is give them as many tools as possible. To have success, because you never know what God's going to call you to at the moment.
Be prepared. And so I think there is that organic sense, but that organic sense doesn't mean don't be prepared.
Yeah,
right?
Totally.
And so thus a book like the one we read is like, here's a tool to hone my mind and my thinking.
Yeah.
So I'm more prepared to understand another person's worldview.
Totally. And
then to understand mine. And then I think also don't assume just because somebody says they're of a worldview that they even have that worldview fully down.
Yeah.
Like I remember like talking with the young elders from another movement that came knocking at my door one time, and I had just done all of my studying on their church.
Yeah.
And I was like, I'm ready. And then as we began to talk, I'm like, they don't know half of the stuff that they're supposed to believe. And it became a totally different conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Someone asks, what is the biggest worldview in Canada? So they knew that, we posted that it was going to be with you.
I would say there's not just one.
Sure.
So these would be like sweeping statements. But so let me just contrast like America and Canada kind of in general statements. So in America, we've often talked about the melting pot. So, we're an immigrant culture from all different parts of the world. And the thought was always that we would melt down and become whatever it means to be American. Now, I think that unique definition is broadly diverse now, and there's not one. That's why we're so divided, because we're all fighting for our version of America.
Yeah.
But that's kind of the mindset, where Canada had a different kind of mindset, and they used the term we're more of like a mosaic blanket. And so people will come and still retain their culture of origin.
Oh, okay.
And so you see a stronger ethnic diversity than maybe you would have we'll still see pockets of that ethnicity here, but that's just more of a thing. Like there wasn't that mindset of you have to become what Canadian is, or Canadian is defined in a different way. Like,
Gotcha.
like we're all Canadian, even if we look radically different. So in some ways, it's kind of beautiful, but it also then creates its own challenges.
Yeah.
So what happens when different values and cultural ethos conflict, and we're not there, so we don't have to solve that anymore.
Yeah, totally.
But I mean, that was some of those things that were there.
Yeah.
And I would say that they're more, I'm going to use the word progressive, but I don't necessarily mean it in a positive way, but they're more progressive on more social fronts than America is, but they're not where Europe is.
Gotcha.
So Europe is far more progressive on certain things.
Gotcha.
And so if we just want a snapshot of what the church is going to be walking into in 20 years, we can look at Europe, and then we look at Canada, and we're like, oh, that's those are the waters we'll be living in.
Yeah.
And so I wish we had a different word for it than progressive, because it has an inherited positive like idea behind it. But I love what C.S. Lewis said once. He goes, it's never progress if you're going in the wrong direction. And so the question is that where we need to go as a culture or not? And then if it's, as a church, if we're like, that's a dangerous place, then how do we hold our line, go against the tide, but then not become defensive, not become the church militant, but become the church invitational?
Yeah, totally. Someone asked a really hard question that is something I've considered or thought about. That's one of those really difficult cultural issues of our day. They asked, does adding pronouns to your work email mean that you're adopting their ideology or building bridges?
Yes. All right. That's a really good question, because that's a thing right now. So I always like tongue in cheek will say like, my pronouns are me, not you. You know, like let me be me, man. Just like, I don't want to play the game, but I recognize that. And so I think so much of that question, what's the intention and why I'm doing it? And so if I'm drinking the cultural Kool-Aid, I'd say like, you probably need to check that.
Yeah.
Right. Not just go down that road. But if you're in a workplace where that's standard practice, you may not even have a choice. Right.
Yeah.
Like, you may have to do that. And so I would say so often you look at moments like that where the culture is going in a direction that I'm not in alignment with, that maybe even feels like it's a violation of my faith. But then what are the models we see in Scripture where people had to be faithful to God in a context that were, and that's why I love the story of Daniel and his friends, because they're these guys. Now, they don't have the rights we do as Americans, which is also confusing for us in our Christianity, because sometimes we're more American than we are Christian in our rights drivenness. And I think Jesus calls us to lay down our rights, and I mean, that's a whole nother podcast. But like, you look at a story like Daniel, and here they are forced to study all things in Babylonian college, which was like witchcraft and sorcery and divination, like stuff that you would be like, run from.
Yeah.
And from Daniel chapter 1, we saw that they got top marks. Like, they were the valedictorians, which means that they studied that culture so that they could understand it and have influence in that culture. And so I would say, like, if you're in a context where the pronoun reality is there, then in faithfulness to Jesus, know who you are, and then be the most gracious, well-thought person in that whole conversation.
Yeah.
And I don't think you're compromising your faith to respect where someone views themselves at, where they're at in their story.
Yeah.
And then to want to just lovingly lead them to Jesus, and then let Jesus deal with their view of pronouns. I think would be there. But I'd say if you're doing it to capitulate or cave in, then that's a whole other conversation.
Virtue signaling kind of.
Yeah. So, but yeah, I mean, that's just kind of where our culture is. And so it's to recognize where that is. And then I'd say, like, if we're looking for bridge building moments, there is some desire for identity, which is why we're throwing out these pronouns, because we're trying to understand who we are.
Yeah.
And so we used to have a more simple definition, just a common understanding of definition. I'm a man, I'm a woman.
Yeah.
Our culture has lost its identity.
Yeah.
And so now we're trying to find ourselves and define ourselves. And so it's like that desire to know who you are is a human desire. And the amazing thing is that when you meet this person, Jesus, he can tell you who you are because he created you. He can tell you who you are more than any cultural view ever can. And so it's just like to affirm that hunger. Yeah. And then just build bridges of conversation around that.
Yeah. So that's the bridge, that identity piece.
Yeah. Absolutely.
That's cool. One last question. Someone asked, as a high school student, how can I talk to my friend about their worldview if they don't even know that they have one?
Yes.
Great question, because I mean, as adults, just as relevant for adults, you know.
Yeah, so I'd say it's whatever this answer is probably a principle applied across the spectrum, but I think it's just ask good questions. non-aggressive tone questions.
Yeah.
Not, why do you believe that? But more like,
Right.
like, hey, what do you think about? Oh, that's interesting. Like, tell me more.
Yeah.
Like, why do you think that? Hey, have you ever thought about? Like, those kind of questions framed in that way, is just there. So, like, I would imagine your average high school student has a cultural milieu of worldviews that they maybe haven't even considered, but they're going to have naturalism thrown in there from what they've been taught in science class,
Right.
which is now going to be in direct contradiction to the things that are being taught in an ethics class or something of that sort.
Yeah.
It's like, well, these worldviews are actually contradicting one another, but they're mishmashing them.
Yeah.
And so just maybe helping them think through, like, well, if you believe this, how does that line up with this?
Yeah.
And again, it's putting them in defensive posture in the sense of you're asking a question that's challenging a thought, but you can frame it in a way that's winsome and kind, right?
Yeah.
So there's certain like conservative talk show people that I'll watch, and I'm like, I don't disagree with your question, but man, you're burning the bridge as you ask it, and it's just like because Jesus asked questions and told stories, and it was to make you think, it was to challenge you, but he never burned the bridge. Even with the Pharisees, who were the most antagonistic group towards him, or the religious leaders, he was always building a bridge. So the whole story of the lost coin, the lost sheep, and the lost son, the prodigal son, the whole premise of those stories is him building a bridge to the religious leaders to join the work of God in finding the lost.
Totally.
And so that cliffhanging ending of the older brother is Jesus' invitation. Are you going to join the party? Or are you going to stay out and be standoffish? Yeah. And I love that. Like, so even to the ones he knows are going to be, that are going to ultimately like trump him up and hand him over to Rome to be killed, he's still building the bridge.
Yeah.
And on the
really
cross, Father, forgive them. They don't, like, he's building the bridge.
Totally.
So
that's awesome. I love that. This past weekend, Michael shared some follow-up resources. If anybody's enjoyed their time in Worldview, thinking about these things, kind of what's next. Do you have one in particular that you'd recommend that you've really enjoyed?
Yeah, I mean, I almost every year or so go back to just Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis. It's amazing how in the era of World War II and leaving World War II that he that material was put together. Like, what are we, like 80 years away from that period of time? I'd have to. I haven't done the math in a while, but the same questions and struggles that he was addressing are what exists today, and he's done such a good job of thinking through questions of morality and why Jesus makes sense, and so that it's worth reading. And I would just say, if you've never engaged with Lewis, beyond Narnia, like go into the next wardrobe of thought with him, and see the deep things that he has. Because the interesting thing is, like, the questions of culture will always resurface, but they'll just have a new expression. But it's often the same question that's there.
Totally.
Like, so we just went and watched the Jesus Revolution movie.
Me too. I just saw it a couple days ago.
Yeah, which I was like, well done, guys. Because I'm a little scared of Christian movies sometimes.
Sure. Yeah.
Just from the standpoint of excellence and how we did it.
Yeah.
But I loved how they were wrestling with the young Greg Laurie's questions in the late 60s and 70s of, like, we're looking for truth, but truth is just, like, I'm like, oh my gosh, here we are now 50 years later. Yeah. And it's the same stuff. And so if you can learn to engage with those things, you realize that, like someone, there's really nothing new under the sun.
Totally. So we wrapped up Worldview this past weekend. We are jumping back into Christ culture and the cross.
Yes.
I know you're not teaching this weekend, but can you give kind of a tease for, like, what that series is going to be as we jump back in?
Yeah, what's fun, where we're going to be at now, running in the Corinthians series, jumping back in there, is we're running up into 1 Corinthians 15, which is where, like, some of the most beautiful things where Paul's talking about the hope that we have as followers because of the resurrection, because of what Jesus has done. And so I love how, like, the timing of the Worldview series, and Michael's very structured. I love the way he'll map things out. Yeah. So we're going to run right up to that, to Easter. Yeah. So I love that we're going to coincide running towards the resurrection as we're running towards Easter as a church. And so, like, we always say, like, hey, it's, this is a really good thing to invite a friend to, but I would just say, like, it's always a good time to invite a friend. Totally. Again, so I think sometimes we're like, I'm worried, what are they going to be talking about or whatever, and I'm like, don't play Holy Spirit. Just invite people to come, because I've been amazed that you invite a friend and you're like, this was the worst Sunday to bring them to, and then they're like, I want to learn more about Jesus, and you're like,
they're talking about hell and giving.
And it's like, and then somehow, like, and God's like, I got this, bro.
Totally.
Like, just play your part.
Yeah, I love that. That's awesome. Cool. Joel, thank you so much for taking the time to
respond
to some questions for us. Just really grateful that you're back at Rocky Peak.
It's so good to be home. It is so good to be home.
We'll see you guys this weekend.
Bye-bye.